Welcome. One of the consequences of living in a mixed economy is that we find ourselves in a society which sometimes protects our individual rights and sometimes does not. What do we do in those situations where the law is stacked against us? When the law doesn't recognize our rights to freedom, our rights to property, do we go along with the law? Are there situations where it's morally acceptable to break a particular law in protest, or situations where it may be practical to violate a law as a way of introducing a particular injustice into the public discussion? This is a subject which exists on the boundary between morality and legality. So it's appropriate enough that I'm joined today by a great legal and philosophical mind, James Valliant. James, how are you doing today?
I'm quite well, and thank you very much for the kind words. Yeah, I think this will be a great discussion. Bad laws are themselves enacting injustice. And so we have to ask ourselves, when is it appropriate to comply with bad laws? Because sometimes it makes us, in effect, the agents of injustice, and we never want to be that, do we?
We don't. And one of the, so a few things that motivated this particular question in my mind. Last week, there was a discussion by Mark and Nikos where they talked about that crazy woman, that climate protester who invaded a wedding of some conservative British minister and threw orange confetti all over the new couple. And how would you respond if somebody did that to you? If it was your wedding or a loved one, how would you respond in that situation? And unfortunately, the law seems to protect such people who trespass on other people's property, violate an event in which they're not invited. If someone did that to me or in a wedding where I participated, I would be seriously tempted to kick that person's ass and consequences be damned. So my question for you, James, is what could I legally and or morally do in such a situation? If somebody's trespassing on property, crashing a private event to which they're not invited, what could I do in such a situation?
Well, obviously, to the extent that the law protected this person, that is wrong. They are guilty of trespass, and reasonable force could be used to remove them before they weren't even invited, before the event, and as they're approaching to do the event. And furthermore, when someone approaches me with an object, and it looks like I don't know who this person is, they weren't invited to my wedding. They're approaching me, and they're going to throw something on me. I don't know what they're going to throw on me. At that point, I have a right to physically remove them, push back, take it out of their hands. You may use reasonable force when it looks like force is going to be initiated against you. Now, in this case, it was just confetti. But even if it was just confetti, obviously, you don't, if you want, the moment you realize it's just confetti, you don't have a right to go beat the pulp out of this person. That's not proportionate to what they did. They weren't threatening serious bodily injury or death. And so to respond with violence would be legally unjustifiable in my mind because it was just confetti. On the other hand, would you have the right to use reasonable force to evict them, to remove them? In fact, if it was a just society, if Great Britain had just laws, would be able to call the police and have that lady arrested, and she'd be spending the night in jail, thank you very much, for having ruined this wedding out of nothing but nihilistic, vicious motives. So it's like that. You know, in 1776, the British colonists in North America got together and said, hey, wait a minute here. New onerous taxes are being imposed on us by Great Britain. And the Parliament of then Parliament in London, and we have no representation there. And for centuries, the English system was that only Parliament could raise new taxes. And in effect, the principle of no taxation without representation was an implicit part of British law for centuries. The king could not raise new taxes. The king had to live on his own, was the doctrine, with his own revenues from his own rents and so forth, until and unless Parliament allowed him to raise money, usually so he could do a war with France or Scotland or something. but the idea was Parliament alone can raise new taxes, and the king can't just do it on his own. Well, here you are. You got a bunch of English lawyers in America saying, hey, wait a minute, we're getting this tea tax, we're getting the stamp tax, we're getting all these other taxes. And guess what? As colonists, we don't have representation in Parliament. Our rights as Englishmen are being violated. We don't have a means of even having a voice in that. There is no peaceful means through representative government. There is no peaceful means through free speech there, whereby we can peacefully change things. And when that occurs, as the Declaration of Independence says, when you've got rights violations that have no peaceful means of address, that you have really, for your own egoistic sake, you have a responsibility to your own life to throw off that government, that tyrannical government. So when do we reach the point? Because take United States today or Great Britain today, it largely does have representative democracy. It more so in America and ever less so in Great Britain has some free speech, and due process of law. When those things go away, then there's no peaceful means of altering a bad law, is there? There's no way for me to persuade everyone else. And let's face it, to change that, I'm going to have to persuade people. Even if I could, by some magic wand, change the law, and if people didn't agree with it, it'd disappear tomorrow. So actually, respecting the process of reason and persuasion in the long run is the only way we're going to achieve a just society and our liberty. So the key here is does a society have a censorship? Does a society have basic respect for due process? Is there a representative means by which peaceful change can occur? And when those things go away, like in 1776, the American colonists have a right to kick out the king. We don't have representation in Parliament. You just can't raise taxes on us willy-nilly or have your troops come in here and take up residence in our homes, et cetera, et cetera. And until that happens, I think people should comply with the law in most cases, all other things being equal. I have to say it that way because there are times when it is impossible to comply. Take a non-objective law, like antitrust law. There is no business person in America who cannot violate that law by simply engaging in business. If you charge too high, well, that's proving that you have monopolistic powers. If you charge too low, well, that's unfair competition. If you charge the same, well, that's prima facie proof you're colluding. So what do? There is, at any time, the antitrust folks can basically come down and charge any business antitrust as they see fit. Normally, they'll keep it for the top business in the field. If you're very successful, that's where they'll train their focus on. But think about it: a non-objective law makes it impossible to comply with the law. Or take a law that actually makes you an agent of someone's rights violation. There, again, I would draw a line. For example, I couldn't directly, morally speaking, I was a district attorney, a professional prosecutor for almost 18 years. Some of the laws in California are rights violations. Many of them are not. But would I be comfortable? I was comfortable doing that because I could prosecute murderers, rapists, kidnappers, thieves, real rights violations. And we were the ones who were prosecuting real rights violations in most cases. But could I have worked for the Securities and Exchange Commission or the antitrust division of the Justice Department? No, sir, I could not. I couldn't live with myself. There I am, an agent of rights violation, because an unjust law is that, a rights violation. Or take a case that puts a doctor in a difficult situation. Let's go back about 30 years. And this may be connected to something we'll say later on, but go back 30 years, back to the day of, I don't know how many people remember Dr. Kevorkian, the guy called Dr. Death. In America, assisted suicide was just murder. There's no real exception at the time, 30, 40 years ago, for a situation where the patient in a terminal case in pain could ask for a more humane way out. It was not lawful. And I was very much an advocate of those kind of laws. And poor Dr. Kevorkian was engaged in civil disobedience, willing to go to prison, in effect, for murders and manslaughters, when what he was doing was creating a device wherein the terminal patient could press a button or turn a dial and end their own life. Now, that is a terrible situation because it puts a doctor in total conflict, it seems to me, with his morality, the rights of the patient, his rights, frankly, as a doctor, and the law in a very serious way. Now, in those situations, like I say, where the law is non-objective or the law is actually compelling you to be an agent in some real rights violation or some horrible cruelty, well, I there have to draw the line. I'm sorry, I'm going to break the law. And I think there's a third category as well. If I want to draw attention to a law through civil disobedience, through protest, I think that can often be a good way. I say often, not all the time. Because again, let's face it, the only way we're going to really change things in the long run is through ideas, through philosophical, cultural change. Pulling a stunt, is usually not going to do it. It can draw attention if there's enough people already on your side, convinced, I think, in some cases. But again, you have to be prepared to take the consequences of that civil disobedience. And Ayn Rand herself was very clear about this. Yes, you can engage in civil disobedience to draw attention to an unjust law, but it gives you no right to violate someone else's rights. So if I were to protest a law and block a highway, block you from getting to work or school or to a hospital, I would be violating your rights. And my civil disobedience doesn't give me a right to violate somebody else's rights. I can't camp in your living room and so forth. But within limits, civil disobedience is appropriate as a way of drawing attention to and protesting an unjust law, so long as you're not hurting someone else, violating their rights.
Well, and that brings up actually a point that I was going to raise. So the tactic that you just mentioned, blocking a public thoroughfare, trespassing on public property, that's something I don't know how common it is in the United States. It's very, very common in Canada, particularly environmentalist groups, native advocacy groups. They block pipelines, they block bridges, they block other important public thoroughfares. Now, in such a situation, let's suppose that I'm going somewhere. I'm going to work, I'm going to the hospital, I'm stuck in my car because somebody is blocking the road. What rights do I have to either get out of my car and physically remove those people from the street, or say, if there's too many of them, to simply drive my car through them and hope that I don't hit or run over anybody? What are the legal and moral implications there?
Well, it was distressing when I hear about those cases, both in Canada and the United States. What I frequently hear these days are that the police officers come in to protect the protesters. If someone gets out of their car and tries to push the people out of the way so they can get along with their lives and have their freedom and not be falsely imprisoned, in effect, they want their freedom. Thank you very much. No, the cops will come in and they'll protect the protesters in the most perverse way you can imagine. This is really turning justice upside down. If you were to ask me, you have a right to self-defense. Obviously, people would see if some nut was running at you with a knife saying, Nicholas, I'm going to kill you. You obviously have a right to shoot him and act in self-defense, right? Well, what if someone is blocking you from getting to a hospital that you need to get to, or blocking you from getting to work that you need to get to, and there's something important going on at work? Do you have a right to use reasonable force? Yes. In my world, an unjust world, you'd have a right to physically remove that guy from being in your way, just as you'd have a right to punch back if he punched you in the face. You are initiating force against me, and I can therefore, in self-defense or even in reasonable defense of someone else, I can use reasonable force, not excessive force. For example, I couldn't pull out a gun and shoot him. That would be excessive force. But could I get out with the other drivers, push these guys to the side of the road and move along? Absolutely. They have initiated force, and my responsive force, so long as it's reasonable, is self-defense. So in a just world, people acting in their reasonable self-defense, pushing these protesters, and now, mind you, I don't care what the cause is. It does not matter to me whether the protesters' cause is just or unjust. It does not give them the freedom, the right, the moral legitimacy to violate anyone else's rights, to interfere with their life. But by what right does some unjust law allow you to violate some individual's rights? I want to hear the explanation for that one. You don't like this because it's violating rights in general, but that gives you what? The right to go violate rights? That is, it seems to me, not only ineffective and suicidal, but getting the whole situation upside down, turning, as I say, into complete perversity, where the cops are protecting the rights violators. No.
Speaking of protecting rights violators, let's talk about shoplifting. So I've heard about these laws that have been passed. I think California is one state that has these laws where it's illegal to pursue a shoplifter who's stolen something below a certain dollar amount. Let's suppose you're a shopkeeper, you own a clothing store, grocery store, whatever, and somebody steals from you. It doesn't matter. It could be $100, could be $500. That means that you could be charged, I don't know, fined, imprisoned, I don't know the details of the law, from pursuing and catching this particular shoplifter. Now, let's suppose enough of these business owners got together and decided, we want to stand up. This law is violating our rights. It's violating our property rights. It's persecuting us as businessmen. And they decide, no, we're going to ignore it. We're going to hire private security. We're going to go after these shoplifters. And so to what extent would such a course be practical? If enough business owners did this, could they actually challenge the law? Could they actually take this to the Supreme Court and challenge the law in some meaningful, practical way?
The legal situation in California is that they keep raising the limit of what felony theft is. Grand theft used to be 30 years ago, 500, then 600, then now it's under 1,000. So you can basically steal $1,000 worth of goods before it actually becomes something that they'll hold you in custody for or treat as a serious crime. Wow. That change is awful. They've also changed a lot of the DAs in California, the DAs in San Francisco and Los Angeles in particular, have, through their, quote, discretion, started to ignore whole aspects of what are the laws in the Penal Code of California. We won't enforce the gun allegations. We won't enforce the gang allegations and things like that. It is currently not unlawful in California for a business owner to use reasonable force to pursue and reobtain their property. However, the civil law is what makes most of these businesses not do it. They're afraid that if their employees are allowed to use force, that the employee themselves will sue them, or the criminal will sue them if they use excessive force. So there's a liability concern on the part of the shops, and obviously it is completely rigged against the store owners. That civil liability case. We need to be able to have a scope of force that can be used by property owners to reacquire the property that doesn't make them afraid of some civil liability down the road. And as I say, if the cops are coming in, if the cops don't do anything at all, which is becoming more and more the situation, or if the cops are actually coming in to protect the criminal, take the case, and these are more serious cases of theft, take the cases that have come out of New York City recently. Guy comes in with a weapon, is trying to do an armed robbery. Now that's a threat of death. Someone comes in with a gun or a knife and says, give me your property. They are threatening murder. You are under every reasonable belief to kill that person because they have threatened killing you in the first instance. An armed robber is a potential murder, and any death that occurs as a result of bullets flying after that is the fault of the robber. Full stop. That's the way it used to be understood. Now get this. Bodega owner uses force, uses a gun or a knife against this guy who's coming in with the armed robbery. And who does New York charge? Who does New York put on Rikers Island, their jail? But the bodega owner acting in self-defense, who had every right to kill that person, in my view. But he didn't. But he was still charged with the assault. Now, again, that's turning the law, and more the law is turned upside down, forcing us into a position where we have to, in effect, violate the standing law to do justice. And to the extent that it really does become a violent or life-threatening situation, I have, under those situations, violate the law proudly and openly. No question about it. If the law is pitting your life or something so significant a value that you're going to have to surrender that to comply with the law, to hell with the law. To hell with the law. And that's that. That's my view. Morality trumps law. Morality tells us what a just law is. When a bad law, by definition, is a law that's going to be unjust and immoral and going to cause someone to do something wrong. Now, if the level of that wrong is, let's say making a right turn signal as your no, the government shouldn't own the roads. Whoever owns the roads should be making the rules for the road. But if the law is such that the law says, yes, in California you can turn right when it's safe on a red light, in New York you can't do that. Well, I think it used to be you couldn't do that in New York. Well, I'll comply with the law. It's no big deal if I live in a basically peaceful system with no censorship. But as we move up the ladder and we get to the point where this bad law is requiring me to put my happiness, my life, someone I love's life against obeying the law, I'm sorry, the unjust law takes the back seat. I'm going to violate that unjust law to protect the higher value. And if necessary, make a big stink about it. Show the world how, in fact, this law has compelled this injustice on me to do. It doesn't allow me to violate anyone else's rights. We're egoists as objectivists. We don't make yourself a martyr unnecessarily. No, try and change the law. Try and live with even a bad law if you live in a society that permits the peaceful change of law. But are there limits to that? Absolutely. There definitely come points with even just unjust laws in a mostly free society where I would say violate the law, do it proudly, because compliance with that law will create a much greater harm than violating it. A much greater rights violation, in fact.
Yeah. It's interesting that Ayn Rand actually addresses this point in one of her essays, The Wreckage of the Consensus. That's her famous essay about the Vietnam draft. And in the conclusion, actually the postscript to the essay, she addresses a question that she'd had from readers to the effect that, well, if I'm drafted into the army, do I have a moral duty to oppose it, even if it means going to jail? And her advice is no, you don't have a right, you don't have a duty or an obligation to martyr yourself. And she, at the end, she memorably says, you don't stop a juggernaut by throwing yourself in front of it.
Bingo.
But the worst, I think the worst tragedy with these unjust laws, these rights violating laws, is they make us feel so helpless. They inculcate this sense of powerlessness in front of an unjust legal system. So the question is, what are some practical, meaningful ways that we can challenge unjust laws? How, for example, do we take a law that's unjust and by violating it, draw greater attention to it and eventually bring about some sort of process where it can be changed?
Well, the draft is a good example that you picked there, because the draft is one of the most pernicious, life-robbing violations. It's a form of slavery in my mind. No, it's not chattel slavery with all of those ugly conditions, but is it involuntary servitude? Is it like, in my mind, things like abortion laws and draft laws are the government in effect saying, we own your life. We can make you go die in some foreign jungle against your will. We can make you a parent against your will and change your whole life. Now, they're the government there is in effect seizing ownership of your life. Wow, I regard those kind of things as very serious violations. If you wanted to make a civil disobedient protest, yeah, but understand you'd be going to jail and you'd be throwing yourself in front of that juggernaut. Ayn Rand is actually laying out the correct things. A lot of people in my country fled to Canada to avoid the draft in the 1960s. I find that perfectly moral. I think Ayn Rand would have found that a perfectly moral thing. I'm not going to get drafted. You're not going to own my life. I'll go to some place where they can't get me for the draft. So that's perfectly moral. On the other hand, think of what the Vietnam War gave us, an opportunity, just the opportunity you're talking about. Most people in America didn't like the Vietnam War, especially as it was dragging out. Most people could see the injustice in that case of the draft. Boy, we really need to force people to do this war because people don't like it. Wait, we're sending young men against their will to die in some foreign hell. People could see concretely the injustice. Take advantage of those moments. You want to change a bad law? And we did. In fact, a student of Ayn Rand's named Martin Anderson, we just had a discussion just last week with Nikos. it was the conservatives that needed convincing. And Martin Anderson was working for men like Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, and he wrote 2 books on the draft. He headed a commission to see on the feasibility of an all-volunteer force, and he was one of the instrumental figures in getting the draft eliminated back in the 1970s. So seize the day, seize the moment, take an opportune issue. I think right now in this country, for example, Americans don't like this student loan forgiveness. The vast majority of Americans can see the injustice of making truck drivers and factory workers pay for other people's university educations through their higher taxes or higher inflation. Oh, that doesn't seem fair to me. And people can see it that way. Hey, you promised to pay back that loan, and now you just want forgiveness on it. People can see, take advantage, seize the moment when people can see those injustices, the draft, or for student loan forgiveness, and strike while the griddle's hot, make a principled argument. Look how effective Alex Epstein is in getting into the debate now about energy in the English-speaking world. He's really making a difference and changing the way politicians talk about it. Seize an issue, specialize, find something where it's a good moment. Victor Hugo, there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. And I say that's what we need to do. Continue with the ongoing philosophical education about rights, the role of government, the morality of individualism. That's what's going to change people's hearts and minds, which is the real way to fix the future. That's the only long-term way to fix the future. But in the meantime, if there are these issues that come up where you can really thrust a spotlight onto an unjust law, do so, and make the most of it. That's how I think is the most effective. But even that doesn't capture the whole of times we need to violate the law, but we really need to violate the law. It may not even be a moment which is politically auspicious, but you need to do the right thing. I would not do a greater injustice. I would not be an agent, no matter what the law said. Even if it was compelling me to be an agent, I would refuse. I would simply put my hands down and refuse to comply with a law that turned me into an agent of greater injustice. No way.
And there have been some notable examples in the 20th century of people seizing the moment, seizing the auspicious moment, as you say, and challenging unjust laws and drawing tremendous attention to it. There's the example of Gandhi with the salt tax, that was imposed by the British on the Indian people. And of course, Rosa Parks refusing to sit at the back of the bus. And those are examples of people who did seize the opportunity and were able to bring about important changes. How about we take a moment to check in with our producer, Daniel, and the super chats and comments from the audience before we get to one more topic.
So first we have a super sticker from Jonathan. Thank you so much. Then a super sticker from Jeff. Also, thank you so much. And 2 super chats, one from Walter and one from Catherine. Thank you both so much. And also a member chat from Bonnie. She says, any thoughts about what the tipping point would look like? Government isn't going to forbid free speech overnight, but haven't they been doing it in bits since antitrust, in fact, with every regulation?
Yes, well,
They have indeed, and that's something that I think deserves a whole episode devoted to the question of free speech. But James, you were going to say in response to that?
Yeah, it is the factual facts on the ground nature of censorship. They could have a law that they ignore, or the law could say free speech, but they're systematically violating free speech in practice. It's the practice on the ground. Do we actually have the freedom to speak our minds? Do we have the freedom to disagree with the state and to disagree with even the majority of people talking? It's that freedom of speech that is essential, and that real concrete ability to do so is what it turns on, in my view. So in America, for example, that injunction, now it's been put on hold, as I predicted, by the Fifth Circuit, but that trial court judge put an injunction that lasted for a little while on communication between the government and social media. When, as the questioner correctly points out, when the government is threatening Twitter and Facebook with antitrust prosecution, And then they call you up and they say, we'd really like you to suppress this sort of information. That is a little more than a request, isn't it? It's a request backed up with a threat, and it's a kind of extortion. And if you can really show that threatening extortion, I mean, the White House spokeswoman, Jen Psaki at the time, said, we're looking into legal consequences if they don't suppress certain information on COVID. Wow, that's an overt threat from the president, in my view. Now, in that case, that is a kind of censorship. And to the extent that has an actual impact, and that's why I say to the questioner, follow that case. Let's see what happens at the end of the day on that case. If the Supreme Court says, yes, the government can, their threats of regulation, their threats of confiscatory taxation can be a form of censorship, I'm all for that, because it can be. It absolutely can be. But it's only government force. It's only if social media all on their own wants to take any political stance or any other kind of stance they want. It's their property. It's their platform. They can do that. So censorship cannot come from Twitter by itself. Censorship has to be the government, in effect, threatening Twitter to say or not say something that makes it censorship. It's the government's threat of force that makes something censorship. And what is the reality of that on the ground is the real test for me. Because if that goes away, then yeah, we need to rebel. We need to take it. We need to denounce the government like Jefferson and Patrick Henry did and say, give me liberty or give me death, and hire George Washington to overthrow the government. Yeah.
So there's one last concrete case that I want to talk about in connection with the morality of disobeying the law. I think this is a very powerful story. And James, can we return to the topic we were discussing before we went live on air?
Sure. I was a little reluctant to do it. That's why I talked about it a little bit with you guys beforehand. I'm going to tell you a story. I was a prosecutor who prosecuted dozens and dozens of murders for almost 18 years. And I'm a big believer in not violating people's rights and trying to comply with a law in a mostly free society. That's why I was a prosecutor. But I had a situation where I really contemplated committing a serious crime when I was a younger man. When I was 29 years old, my 30-year-old brother was dying of terminal illness. And 30 years ago was when this was happening, around 1990. That was back in the day of Dr. Kevorkian, Dr. Death, as he was called. Now, there was a man engaged in some civil disobedience. People who were in pain, had terminal illness, and wanted to die could not get medically assisted suicide, even if they couldn't do it themselves. And what Dr. Kevorkian would usually do is set up a system where they could press a button or turn a dial and end their own life when they chose. And it was only terminal patients who really wanted this, and he had it on tape and stuff. So in my view, without getting into all the details, the basic idea make Dr. Kevorkian, at least in general, a hero in my mind. Here he is bravely helping people, violating the law, willing to go to jail for murder or manslaughter to bring attention to this terrible, unjust law causing all kinds of misery and violating people's rights, in my mind. That was the political context. And my own brother, with whom I was very close, we were only a year apart, had HIV/AIDS. And again, around 1990, it's not like today where they have the cocktails that can really extend your life, give you mostly a normal lifespan, and at least delay the onset of the symptoms for many years. They didn't have those medications. And so it was basically a death sentence when you were diagnosed with AIDS. And I watched for the course of a year and a half as my brother fell apart in many ways. It was very painful for me to watch because I was very close to and loved my brother, only a year apart. I watched him go blind. I watched the pain increase. I knew exactly what he would have wanted and exactly what he wanted. I mean, when he first told me about it, I invited him, that he had AIDS, invited him to my apartment. I said, Wayne, you're losing a lot of weight. What's going on? He said, now don't you tell mom and dad, but I've got HIV. And I started crying. And he said, okay, I'll let you cry this time, Jimmy, but this is it. We're going to enjoy life to the maximum. His courage was an inspiration to me. Every day of his life thereafter that we could, we did things that we loved to do together. We made the most out of life. And he was that kind of a courageous, life-loving guy. But I also knew that he didn't want to hang around just in pain and just, be in a coma or be in misery for the last weeks or days of his life. So when it finally comes to it, he's in the hospital room the last couple nights of his life. We didn't know how the doctor was going to react. We didn't know if he'd have the courage of a Kevorkian or something. And my mother and I knew exactly what my brother wanted. My brother was in deep pain, and he couldn't really talk to me this night before he died, his second night of life. And I honestly contemplated, when I was alone in the room with him, taking the pillow and putting him out of his misery. And would that have been murder under the existing laws? A serious violation of the law? Not his rights, in my view. It would have been a protection of his rights, in my view, that was made impossible through the medical system, I thought. I'm sorry if I'm a little emotional. It had a big impact on my life, but I honestly there contemplated ending the life of one of the people I loved most in this world, because the law was unjust, and I was not going to allow him to suffer for days or weeks against what I knew he wanted. Fortunately, the doctor came in and said, I think Wayne's in a lot of pain, and I think we're just going to keep turning up the pain meds and the Ativan, and we'll just keep turning it up. Wink. And the next night he passed away peacefully, and so I didn't have to do that. But would I seriously contemplate doing that? Would I have been willing to take the consequences? Would I have been willing to go to jail for it? You damn right I would have. It would have been worth. I was doing that selfish calculation exactly in my head, and I was saying, nope. If I have to spend the rest of my life in prison, I'm not going to let him drag out the rest of his life in misery unnecessarily. And if necessary, I will draw attention to this evil legal situation that doesn't allow terminally ill patients to end their own lives. That was my belief at the time, at least. And so I want to point out, I think what that story shows, and I didn't mean to do it just for, self-pity or something, because it was more than 30 years ago, about 30 years ago, and I've dealt with it since. But I just want to draw out the reality of what unjust laws do, They compel rights violations rather than protecting rights. An unjust law compels a rights violation. And as I say, if it's just a minor thing, like, the traffic laws, or even, step it up even a bit more, that only have a modest impact, impose some cost, I'm willing to comply if I live in a society in which I can change things. There's no censorship. There's some kind of representative government. If I have that, I will try and live within the laws, obey the laws. I don't want to make myself a martyr, nor do I want to create a world, that's not good for me or anyone else either, to create a world in which there's general disrespect for the law. On both grounds, I want to try to comply with the law insofar as I can. But am I aware of the fact, acutely and personally, aware of the fact that laws oftentimes put us in these unwinnable Kobayashi Maru, no-win scenarios where some terrible, terrible thing, we're being forced to be agents to some terrible injustice because of the injustice of the law. And there, if you're willing to take the consequences, my friend, I have nothing more, I have no negative moral judgment against you. If the law if you're intentionally violating a law that is itself unjust and compelling a rights violation, that is for you to judge. It really is. And if it's serious enough, you're never going to get a complaint from me.
Thank you very much for sharing that story, James. I think this episode has given our viewers a lot to think about. Don't step in front of the juggernaut, but if you rationally judge that there's a particular law where protecting rights, not violating rights, protecting rights necessitates disobeying, standing up to an unjust law, especially if it draws more attention to the case, we need more and more people to have that kind of courage. Daniel, let's check in with our audience once more. Any final super chats or super stickers before we sign off?
We have a super chat from Free Trade. He says, really touching story, James. Thanks for sharing. Great show, guys. And we also have a super chat from Jeff. He says, I'm currently studying for my security guard license. I only have citizens arrest powers, but also massive duty of care restrictions. should it be legal to violate that duty?
I would advise you to stick within the parameters of the rules that you're told to do. You do have all kinds of liability, and your employer has all kinds of liability that will restrict your ability. Misdemeanor powers of arrest. Everyone has the right to engage in a citizen's arrest if it's happened right in their presence. If you're an immediate witness and you're right there in a misdemeanor, you can say, you're under arrest and I'm going to hold you here until we get a police officer here. It's called citizen's arrest. If it's a felony, you need to go report that to the police, because they're the ones who have the power to investigate a felony. A felony is a crime with more than a year in custody as a penalty. It's the general distinction between felony and misdemeanor in the English-speaking world. So if it's a serious crime, and felonies can have all kinds of other impacts. You can lose your right to vote. You're in America, your right to possess a gun, even licensed gun. There are other consequences to a felony conviction. So it's a serious thing. So when it's a felony, you need to report it to the cops. So as a security guard, I would stick within the parameters. You really aren't peace officer licensed by the state to enforce or investigate felonies, and your employer has all kinds of liability. And the liability laws are insane. I'm not defending that. You as a security guard should have greater ability to use force and to prevent theft and to go after thieves. That is what's being chipped away at that side. But again, do the best you can in protecting the rights of your employer within the laws as best as you can. That would be my sincere advice.
And of course, while taking care of your own personal safety. And I know that people who train to be security guards learn this, that your own safety, your own well-being is paramount. Very, very important point.
Yeah, number one. Absolutely. Good luck out there, because it's getting tougher and tougher to be a private security guard for businesses these days. So my heart goes out to you.
Mine too. James, this has been a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much for all of your insights and reflections. Daniel, any final comments or announcements for today?
So upcoming shows today at 9 p.m. UK time, Harry Binswanger will interview Fiona Miller.
Wow, can't miss that. Harry interviews Fiona Miller. I'm definitely going to check that out. You know, folks, what we provide here is on a daily basis are the applications of philosophic ideas to real world situations. If you find that useful, if you find that thought-provoking, if you find it helpful, if you think it's important to create a worldwide community of like-minded people, here, like we do at the Ayn Rand Center UK, please, please consider becoming a paid subscriber of Value for Value. That's what keeps the lights on around here. If you want these kind of discussions to keep going on, like the interview with Harry coming on later today, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. And we have different subscriber levels too now. Do check it out. Contact Rosie Ginsburg, contact someone with Ayn Rand Center UK, or just hit like, subscribe, join, share, comment, because all that helps us too. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James. And thank you to all our wonderful viewers. We appreciate your time and we appreciate your support. Look forward to chatting with all of you again very soon. Until then, I wish you all the best of premises. Have a great day.
Be well.